We will begin in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for people to show up. And I will stay muted until then. Is this better for sound? Hi, thank you for coming to the second workshop. What we'll be doing today is we'll be discussing the first two stories you're going to be telling in your presentations. And these are going to be the story of your user or your user story, and secondly, the story of the size of your market, or in other words, your market story. So let's get right to it. So before we begin, let's briefly remember what we talked about in our previous workshop when we looked at the whole pitch as a whole, and you'll see the same pyramid. And what we'll be engaged with today are the first two stories. So the first one is the top of the pyramid, purpose, problem, and solution. And the second one is the third line of the pyramid, the why now market and competition. We'll leave your product, business model, team, and finances aside for a moment for now, and we'll be looking at those at a separate workshop. So firstly, let's talk briefly about this user story thing that we're going to be talking about today. Now, you're going to have to do three things here. The first one is you're going to have to explain what your purpose is, and your purpose should always be external. So your purpose isn't something you do for your own egotistical reasons. Your startup's purpose is to change people's lives. How do you change them? Why do you change them? Why is this important? Why is this something worth doing? Now, secondly and thirdly, you're going to have to describe the problem and the solution, and we'll talk about each of those two as we go through them, just keep in mind that when you're going to be talking about the problem, you need to make this problem very, very, very clear, right? In other words, people actually have to feel the problem that you're presenting. Kind of like when you're watching a very, very sad movie and you start crying. This is kind of the effect that we're going to be looking for, but instead of crying, we want people to get an appreciation of what the problem is. That will then allow us that when you come to your solution, your audience will actually be relieved and you'll be onboarding them onto this process of designing a better world that you're trying to pitch to them. Now, before we go into the actual presentation, there's a couple of things that we should look at. Now, the first thing that we're going to have a look at is how we model user behavior. Because what you'll be doing all the time effectively, as well as when you're preparing for your pitch, as well as you're designing your product, is you're going to be creating models of how your users behave. However, you're going to be creating these models in two separate ways. So we're going to take a look at both of these. So the first one is the user modeling that you're doing in order to be successful at pitching. And the second one is the user modeling that you're engaged with while you're developing your own product. Now, firstly, let's take a look at pitch user modeling. Right? Firstly, as you're going to be modeling your user for the pitch, this is going to be extremely emotional. You want to use words that are going to evoke a response. Right? So when people are sad, they are sad. When they are angry, they should be angry. Right? Secondly, they should be meaningful in an everyday sense. So the words that you're going to be using as you're going to be describing your user should be simple words that your mama will understand, should be some words that we use in our everyday lives, right? So don't use highly technical terms, stuff that only your fellow programmers or engineers would understand. You want to create meaning that is accessible to each and every person. Thirdly, these models should be colorful, right? They should be diverse, kind of like a very good novel. So for instance, consider Tolkien and his 2-page long descriptions of a sunset. This is something that you're aiming for. Of course, we could argue that Tolkien is overdoing it in this case, but you should strive towards allowing people to experience what you're actually saying. And in much the same way as a photo that has been washed out looks unimpressive or kind of detached, and a fully colorful landscape photo is much more engaging. The same goes for the language that you're using. If your language is going to be bland, you're going to be uninteresting, and unfortunately, people will stop listening to you. Now, fourthly, the model that you're going to be making for your users, for your pitch, is going to be fairly narrow. It's going to concern mostly one use case, one or at most two different types of context, and you're going to be very, very focused in that description. Lastly, your pitch description is going to be very, very contextual, right? So you're going to want to tell the story of where the user is, what they're doing, what have they done before, what are they going to do next. On the other hand, when we talk about user modeling as you're developing your product, it's almost completely the opposite. So instead of being very narrow, it's going to be very wide. You want to engage as many different situations the user might find themselves in, so that you can best cater to them. Secondly, it's going to be feature-oriented instead of context-oriented in a way, right? So you want to know what the user wants to do, what actions do they need to perform, and you don't necessarily care if they're sitting in the park or if they're at home or if they're at their grandma's. That doesn't necessarily add to the information that you need to successfully develop your product. Now, lastly, as you're going to be developing your product and your user model for the product, you want to engage in habit loop forming. So it turns out that most of the stuff that people do in their everyday lives is determined by habits. We do it on autopilot, right? And these are things like going to bed, waking up, sleeping, even having sex is something that we do mostly on autopilots, right? And these are all habits that we form. Now, the most transformative products are the ones that are able to hack the habit circuitry of their users and actually make them form new habits. So consider Facebook in this case, right? Facebook has become such a big thing because we almost on autopilot, as soon as we open the browser, we go on Facebook to check what's going on, right? None of us do that consciously, and that is something that gives so much strength to Facebook in this case. Now let's take a look at some of the things that you shouldn't be doing as you're going to be describing your users. Firstly, you shouldn't be using buzzwords. And we're going to define buzzwords here as any type of semi-technical term that is being used by mainstream media, right? It means that it has become so filled up with meaning that you won't be able to use it effectively. And it's not just going to be a useful tool for you to explain yourself. And secondly, because at one point buzzwords hit a certain level of popularity that turns the people in the know or the technological hipsters away, you might even turn your audience away if you're going to cram your speech with buzzwords. The second important thing that you shouldn't be doing is you shouldn't be using empty words. So words like best, very cool, well-designed, etc. are words that effectively mean nothing. They mean nothing because, for instance, user-friendly for me means something completely different than from my mom, because I've seen a bunch of different websites. I experienced the web in a very, very different way and in a much more thorough fashion than my mother. So something that she would describe as user-friendly wouldn't necessarily align with my description of a thing. Now, this matters because when you're going to be using empty words, because of this dissonance between how people understand them, they're not going to mean anything. So as you're pitching your product, and if you say that it's user-friendly, this literally means nothing. If you want to pitch a particular feature or a particular aspect of your product, that's perfectly fine because you're going to be concrete. Just stay away from these empty words. Now, thirdly, consider how you describe the world around you, right? Often when people start pitching, there's a variety of different things they try to do that they don't necessarily engage in their everyday life. So try to use everyday language. Now, lastly, let's talk about this idea of the inflation of awesome. And this is something that has been happening lately, and that necessarily in a way happens to each and every language that we use, which is the fact that we have now, because of so many marketers on the internet, etc., started describing things with a bunch of superlatives. So awesome, epic, the best, etc. These words have suffered inflation. The reason that is harmful for you is because whenever you're going to try to describe a thing and you want to say that this is awesome, or you want to say that it's really amazing, and you're going to use one of these words that are being overused on the internet, people are just going to tune out. You're going to get a much, much better response if what you're going to be doing is using words that are very specific and maybe describe the feeling of how it is to use this product, instead of just slapping a label on that says awesome. Now, again, we'll take a look at the magic chart to remind us what we're actually doing when we're pitching, right? So number one, you're going to have 5 minutes for your pitch, and you cannot expect to convince anyone in 5 minutes to actually give you 100,000 euros. What you will, however, convince your VC is to take you to lunch, to bring you to a new meeting, to continue discussing things. But secondly, in the grand scheme of things, what you're actually doing is, please remember, you're looking for money that you need when your total costs are much bigger than your income, with the promise that this is going to change. Unless you're able to show that to your investors, you're going to have a very, very big problem. Now, let's look at the market story that we'll be working on today. You're going to have to do 3 things. You're going to have to explain why now is the right moment. You're going to have to identify and show your market. And lastly, you're going to have to discuss your competition. Now, let's consider briefly the graph, the chart that we've already looked at previously in our first lecture, just to remember the phases that we were talking about, right? So first, you're in customer discovery when you're trying to figure out what your customers want. Secondly, you're in customer validation when you're trying to figure out how to price your product, whether or not people are willing to pay money for it, how do they want to pay money for it, how do you deliver it. Then you go into the execution phase, which is at the point where you should start getting money. So in your pitch, what you want to show is that the customer discovery and customer validation phases are largely over for you, and that what you're now onto is to start creating new customers and building a customer base. Now, this chart that we're looking at right now is actually very interesting, and I think we should spend a minute or two talking about it. So there's 2 lines in this chart. Actually, there's 3, but we'll ignore the blue one for now. So the 2 lines, the green and the red one, the green one shows how big your customer acquisition cost is. What this basically means is the amount of money you need to spend to get your customers. So if, for instance, you're using Google AdWords, this is the amount of money you need to throw in there to get one sign up. Or if you're using Jumbo posters, this would be the amount of money you paid for these Jumbo posters for a month, divided by the amount of users that you got because of these Jumbo posters in this month. The red line on this chart shows the value that you're bringing to the user, and in other words, the amount of money that user is willing to pay you in order to buy your product. Now, as you're going to see, these two lines often don't align directly, but the point that we're going to make here is the following. If you're bootstrapping your product, right, so as long as you don't have an investment and you have to make enough money to survive and to cover your costs, you'll want to do this at the point that is marked with the blue line that is crossing the red and green ones. Right? It shows that the difference between the two is the greatest, which means that you're going to hit your user segment, your market segment, very, very carefully and very precisely, and you're going to find those users that need your product now the most, and that it brings them the highest amount of value so that you're going to be able to fund your endeavors. On the other hand, if you get an investment and you're full of cash, you basically want to operate on the left-hand side of this chart, right? Where your customer acquisition cost is great, but the value that you bring to your users is extremely high as well, so that you can capitalize on word of mouth, on the happiness that you bring to your users, etc. Now, lastly, let's take a look at this chart that we've already took a look at in the previous lecture, but we'll be looking at it again and again. Just to remind you, the bluish part here shows the size of the market in time, and the reddish part here shows the groups of people who are now buying your product and how that relates to the size of the market. Now, keep in mind that you should be aware of in which phase you are. In an ideal world, you've already crossed the chasm. If you haven't, this is where your VC should help you. Now, remembering again what total available market, serviceable available market, and serviceable obtainable markets are. The total available market are all the people who have this problem and could possibly buy your product. Your serviceable available market is the group of people who you can actually bring this product to, so the group of people who you can service and are available to you. And your serviceable obtainable market is the actual market share that you can get because of competition, or because people don't yet know that your product exists. What you're pitching as your market size to the investors is actually the smallest one of these circles, so the market that you can actually obtain and service. So let's go into the slides of the presentation, and we'll be looking at different presentation examples here from different pitches, and we're going to go through the slides that we just covered in broad terms. So firstly, let's begin with purpose. We already talked about that your purpose should be a one-sentence statement. We talked about that it should be targeted towards your users, and we talked about how it should still align with your startup's values, and it should paint a picture of a world that you want to see coming. So this is the perfect purpose slide from the pitch by DressRush, and they do it very simply. They say, we are changing the way people shop for weddings. Right? So we know what their purpose is. This isn't a detailed description of what their startup is, but we get an idea of what they're about, and we get the feeling that we would like to join them on their mission. So you're going to be working on your purpose slides continuously. Don't be afraid of putting something up there that you're not completely satisfied with. This is a process. It isn't something that you can come up with in 15 minutes. Now, the second slide that we're going to go through is the problem slide. And as we already talked about, it becomes very, very, very important for your audience to understand and even feel the problem that your typical user faces. Now, we've looked at an example in workshop number 1 by Analyze, where we saw that they told a story of a single person who has this problem through words. We're now going to look at a slightly different slide by SEO Moz, which has this difference that it was designed for reading, not necessarily presenting, but I still feel it's a very good example to understand the logic of how you should present the problem. Now, here's the slide, and you can ignore the pie chart in the middle because it's just something that gives them credibility, and we'll talk about this in a moment. But on the left top-hand side, you see the first statement, which says that organic drives 90% or more than 90% of all traffic on the internet, but people only invest around $5 billion into it, at least in 2011. However, paid drivers account for less than 10% of web traffic, and this is in the green square, but we choose to invest 6 times more money into this, right? And the problem here has been laid out to us. There's this thing that works that nobody spends money on, and there's this thing that doesn't work that everyone seems to be throwing money into, and they're throwing this money away. So even as we present this problem in such a way, an apparent solution pops up immediately, right? So a solution to this would be something that allows us to throw money into organic drivers of traffic so that we can then get a much higher return on investment. And SEO Moz is going to argue that this is what they are. The third slide that you need to do needs to present the solution. But please remember, this still needs to be an abstract solution. We're not talking about directly about your product. We have just identified the problem, and now we want an idealized solution. If this was a perfect world, we would have a machine that does A, B, C, and D, which would then solve our problem. So let's take a look at an example. Here's an example by Speakeasy. Speakeasy are a startup that deal with events. They want to bring people who go to events, event organizers, and bars together. And here's how they propose their solution. Keep in mind, they're not talking about their product. We don't know where their buttons are. We don't know anything about it yet, except an idealized version of how they see the world becoming after they go public. So they say an ideal solution would be social, which means it would promote events and allow people to meet new people. An ideal solution would also have a geographical component. It will allow you to map your events and find events that are near you. And it would have a payment component that would allow you and bars and organizers to buy and sell more drinks, tickets, and food. Right? And this is the level at which we now understand what type of mechanics this product needs to support. So at the point where they start talking to us about the product, we get to have a map of understanding where different features fit in and why they were a good or bad idea. So this is what you want to achieve on your solution slide. Now, moving on to the why now slide. This is one of the hardest slides because it really takes some ingenuity, and you really need to show your understanding of market trends when you want to do this. So let's take a look at an example. And this is an example, ironically, by a startup that doesn't exist anymore. So they closed down. The startup is called Subscria. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to become a sort of Shopify for subscription services. So Shopify is a service where you can launch a web store just by clicking some buttons and you can start selling. They wanted to create the same type of thing, but for subscription services like Birchbox. The reason why I like this slide is that even though in the end this startup failed, this slide is still convincing today. Okay? So here's what they do. How do they explain why now is the right moment to invest into something like Subscria? They say today, people spend $226 billion online, and there's a 45% growth in this. And in 2016, we're going to be spending $327 billion. The average person today spends about $1,000, and in 2016, they will spend almost twice as much, $1,738. All right? Now, that, however, isn't enough for them to claim that now is the right moment, because e-commerce has been growing for the past 10 years, right? So we've seen this growth. It might have gotten faster, but at the end of the day, this growth of e-commerce isn't enough yet for Subscria to be a viable business. What they add to this is they analyze the changes in consumer habits, and they say right now what is also happening next to this e-commerce growth is that new business models are starting to gain traction. So we have Birchbox, Foodsie, Kiwi Create, etc., who allow users and are getting them used to these types of subscription services. Now, if users are actually getting used to these types of services and they like them, then the moment truly is now. So please remember that explaining why the moment is now isn't going to be explained simply by you showing us how much the market is growing, but you also need to give us, let's call it, a sociological perspective of why people are willing to engage in the types of actions your product wants them to engage in. Slide number 5 is going to be your market size. Now, there's a variety of different ways you can do this. We'll be looking at different examples in our different workshops. What we're going to look at today is what I feel is a very, very cool example, even though it's slightly unorthodox. And it's by DressRush, the startup that we looked at their first slide, so their purpose slide. They're changing the way people shop for weddings, and this is how they explain how their market size functions. Firstly, they say there's 2.7 million weddings per year. And they say each wedding has 1 bride, 1 groom, 4.5 bridesmaids, and 4.5 groomsmen, and 2 ushers. This gives us 14 members and 152 guests per an average wedding. They then go and say, this gives us 445.5 million people each year in our target market, which gives us $28,000 per average cost per person per wedding. Okay? Now, before we move on to this slide where they go and explain that this is 75.6 billion that are being spent each year for their market, let's discuss the shortcomings of this calculation. So at the bottom where they say that this means that $28,000 are spent on average per person per wedding, they're taking an average which is heavily skewed by the massive outliers of weddings that cost a couple of $1 million. So a median, for instance, a middle person, a middle spending person, let's call them, for weddings is going to spend considerably less, which means that because Dress Rush is trying to optimize shopping for weddings, they probably won't be able to operate on the market for weddings that cost $1 million, because these people don't really care about optimizing their costs for a wedding. So at the end of the day, their market effectively is going to be much smaller, if not just considerably smaller, than the 75.6 billion stated here. And please be careful of that in your calculation, that you don't destroy the value of your market by simply averaging some stuff, because investors are economically minded people. They will probably catch up on this and they will ask you tough questions. And it's just a shameful mistake to have because it's very easy to avoid. Now, let's take a look at competition. And we already looked at a competition slide in our previous workshop when we looked at Analyze. And we saw that they decided to give us a spreadsheet where they were listing functionalities and who has them and who doesn't. Now, this slide is slightly different, and we're coming back to Subscria, the failed startup. And the reason why I enjoy this competition slide is because it's incredibly simple. So you've got 2 categories on the left. There's 2 types of businesses. Either they're subscription focused or not focused on subscription. And then in the columns, you also have 2 categories. Either they require coding or they allow you to start immediately. And they say there's a bunch of tools for either situation that require coding. And there's a bunch of tools that allow you an immediate start and are not focused on subscriptions. But there is no one except Subscria in the square where we have services that allow you to start immediately and that are focused on subscriptions. So that positions them in a unique position on the market, and it's extremely clear to us why they have a great advantage and why they have targeted a segment that they will most likely succeed at, even though in the end it turned out they failed. So this was a brief overview of what you should be doing in your user story and in your market story, and this is what we're going to be checking next time, so that you'll want to make sure that these first 6 slides are pimped out until our next workshop, where the comments that I'm going to be giving you are also going to focus on this. So on these 6 slides. And now I will meet you at the Merlin platform that hopefully today is not going to fail on us. You're going to have to go to the link that is on the website, and you're going to log into Merlin with Facebook. And after you do that, you choose your team name, and please have 1 person per team. So have 1 computer ready for your team where you log in and you choose your team name. And please be careful of how you type it in, because the next time you're going to have to type the same team name. Of course, there's an autocomplete, but just make sure that you're not going to duplicating your team names. You then go and upload your SlideShare presentation. You have to allow the browser to access your microphone. Yeah, when you are asked, so the browser is going to ask you, there's going to be a pop-up on top if you're using Chrome. Make sure that you don't click deny then, because there isn't an easy way to allow access to the microphone. So click the right button, and then if you signed into Merlin already before this lecture started, just reload the page and do everything you need to do. So just to go through the process quickly again, you log in, you choose your team name, you upload the SlideShare presentation, you allow the app to access your microphone, and in the case that you already signed into Merlin, just refresh, and I will see you there in a minute. Thanks for your attention.